Sorry, could I ask everybody to perhaps move down a little bit so we can be more comfortable and cozy and romantic? Thank you. I don't know why people in the auditorium always leave the first 10 rows open. Right. Shall we get started?
So an outro for how long?
Hour-ish, technically.
Maybe less than that.
Yeah, that's fine. And we have plenty of time for
We have the
questions.
room until what, till 2?
Until we're done. But typically this thing will start seeing people leaving around
Yeah, I think
because of classes.
I'm not going to talk about Mexico at all, but I'm sure it's going to come up, so that'll be more for the,
Okay.
yeah.
So, okay.
Afterwards.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us over this lunch break for this kind of public talk. I'd like to welcome you all to this public talk that is entitled The Democratic Competition, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is organized by the División de Estudios Políticos. My name is Steven. Hello. Today we welcome Professor Ian Shapiro, who is a Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale University, and he's also the director of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Professor Shapiro has talked widely throughout the past decades about kind of crossroads between political theory, political philosophy, law, and even to some extent social science methods. And the presentation that he will give here today is kind of exemplifying all these different areas. His publications are really too many to kind of name within this 1 hour and a half span. The only thing perhaps that I would like to say is that his latest book, The Politics of Domination, is now widely available on the internet and will soon also be available in your local library. In addition to his research and his teaching, I think what is also kind of particularly interesting for students here is that he convenes an online kind of seminar or course that is called The Moral Foundations of Politics, and I would strongly recommend this to everybody. So I will not talk for much longer. The only thing that kind of remains is for me to generally thank Professor Shapiro for making a pit stop in Mexico in between all his other worldwide destinations and joining us here for this talk. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Ian Shapiro.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me without the microphone? Yeah? Because I prefer to stand. So I'm going to talk about...
I'm sorry, could you, because we're recording.
Think I should hold it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so better if I hold it?
Sorry.
Okay. The subject of my talk is democratic competition, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it is addressed to the current tensions in democratic politics that have emerged in many countries. My experience of these tensions is obviously colored by the fact that I live in the US and I spend much time in Europe, but the book is actually comparative. And so I'm not going to have anything much to say about Mexico in my opening remarks, but I'm sure you all know much more about Mexico than I do, and I'm sure it's going to come up once we get into the discussion. Probably I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then open it up. But if anybody wants to interrupt me, feel free. Just put up your hand and stop me. if I'm not making sense to you, I'm probably not making sense to at least 20 other people. So they'll all be happy if you interrupt me and stop me. So this is joint work with Francis Rosenbluth, a colleague of mine at Yale, who is a political economist and a specialist in comparative electoral systems. Much of her work has been on Japan, but she also writes about Europe. And the motivation for the book is really a puzzle or a paradox. And the paradox is that over the last 4 decades, really since the mid-1960s, in democratic political system after democratic political system around the world, there's been huge pressure to democratize political parties and political decision-making, by which I mean decentralize control of political parties, bring politics closer to the people. So we've had a variety of mechanisms for that, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But they've all been in the direction of disempowering what is seen as corrupt and distant political elites, and empowering local democracy, local control of either politicians or decision making. And that is obviously, to some degree, a reflection of a profound sense of political alienation among electorates, or they wouldn't have been pushing for these things. There's been this very powerful movement that's taken different forms in different countries, but asserts itself over much of the democratic world. But on the other hand, if you look over this 4 decades, by almost every measure of public opinion, focus groups, quantitative measures, qualitative measures, voter alienation has actually increased. So you have this apparent paradox that on the one hand, we have decentralized control of politics, taking politics closer and closer to the people who were feeling alienated. But after 35 or 40 years of it, they feel even more alienated than they did 35 or 40 years ago. Now you might say that's just a coincidence or it depends on other things. After all, there are many reasons. There are many reasons for voters to feel alienated from politics. We've heard a great deal about the declining power of politicians because of globalization, so they can't protect their populations. We've heard, of course, in the shadow of Thomas Piketty about the massive growth of inequality since the 1970s, particularly the concentration of wealth among the very rich. This, Piketty's argument is that because returns to capital are greater than returns to other factors of production, over time the capital gets richer and richer and richer at the relative expense of everybody else. So we have these massive growth of inequality. Gini coefficients have been going up. And then when we saw the slowing of growth since the financial crisis, this has produced wage stagnation and even in some countries wage decline, high levels of unemployment. At the same time, Western governments have tended to bail out the banks and the elites at the expense of many millions of people, for example, in the US who lost their homes as a result of the financial crisis. So there are many, many reasons for people to feel angry, disaffected, alienated, and then we could add to this, certainly for the US and many European countries, the failed wars in the Middle East, which have cost trillions of dollars, many, many lives, and haven't brought anything except increases in the national debt. So there are many, many reasons why people might feel alienated. Nonetheless, we're arguing in this book that the apparent paradox is real, that even though there are plenty of other reasons for voters to feel alienated from politics, in fact, the decentralization of politics is itself a cause of the increased alienation that prompted the pressure to decentralize the control of politics. So it was a response to a real problem, but it's been the wrong kind of response because it actually has made the problem worse. It is, and the reason it's been made the problem worse, there's more than one, but which I'm going to go into. But the net effect of these reasons is that we have governments that are even less capable of delivering what voters want than they were 30 or 40 years ago. And voters fail to realize that part of the problem is the way in which politics has been reorganized. So our thesis is going to be in some ways a traditional thesis. It's that the best form of political competition in a democracy is to have two big, strong parties. They have to be big in the sense that they need to be all-encompassing parties, not the products of coalition arrangements. And they have to be strong in the sense that the party leaderships, which are not necessarily the same as bureaucrats and elites, I'll make a distinction there, but the party leaderships need to be able to define the party programs over which parties are then going to compete for the votes of electorates. So that's where we're going to come back to. So let me just flesh out this claim that I'm making, first of all, the historical claim that we've seen a massive weakening of political parties and their leaders. Again, just to give some examples of this, since the 1960s in particular, we've seen the rise of primaries and what we call caucuses, which are sort of local meetings for the selection of candidates in the U.S. For the selection of candidates, I believe in the Mexican system, the selection of single member, I know you have a two-tiered system, but I believe you have primaries in many states for the selection of candidates. Is that right? Yeah? No? In some states?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's certainly in the U.S., primaries, which came in the progressive era in the early part of the 20th century, then sort of fell into disuse, came back with a vengeance in the 1960s and have had a huge effect on the selection of candidates. And the same is true in many countries, in many mature democracies. For example, in a country like Israel, which actually has PR, they're one of the few countries that managed to combine PR with primaries. That's, you'll see, I think that's got something to do with some of the pathologies of their system. In the US, this is a particularly US-centric innovation. They've created majority-minority districts in order to get more descriptive representation, as they call it, more African Americans elected in Congress. They have designed constituencies in order to get as many African Americans into his constituency as possible to get them representation. And it does get them representation, but at enormous cost for the rest of the dynamics of the system. And this is one of the things I'm going to talk about, because sometimes what has happened is you get reforms that are a response to one discrete problem. In this case, the lack of African Americans in Congress. So they design a reform to that without thinking about the effects of that reform on the rest of the system. So for a healthy two-party system to function, for example, we have something called Duverger's law. So Duverger's law says that in single-member district systems, you'll get two big parties provided the median voter in the district is similar to the median voter in the country, right, in terms of their politics. So you won't get, for instance, you can have a single-member district system in India, but you don't get two big parties because there's huge regional variation in India. Although the regional variation is getting less important in the last few years, and so it's starting to look more like a two-party system. But really, for the Duverger's law to work, and we think Duverger's law is really important for healthy political competition, you need your constituencies to more or less mirror the national polity in terms of diversity. And so obviously if you create majority-minority districts and put all your African Americans into that district, you're also going to undermine Duverger, because you're going to stop having constituencies that more or less reflect. And I think that this is emblematic of the sorts of problems that have been generated by piecemeal reforms to address one discrete problem that are not addressed in a way of thinking about the system as a whole. I mean, just while on this subject of minority representation, for example, there are other ways of addressing it that don't screw up Duverger. For example, in India, they had something in 1934 called the Pune Pact. And the Pune Pact said that in 34 constituencies for the Indian Parliament, only untouchables could run as candidates. So all parties had to run untouchables. And in New Zealand, they did the same thing with Maoris. They said in certain specified districts, they were randomly selected districts, only Maoris could run. So that way you get descriptive representation, or in PR systems, you can, as in some of the Northern European countries, they say every other person on the list or every third person on the list is going to be a woman. These are ways you can get descriptive representation without screwing up Duverger, right? Because you then don't have to create these constituencies which have all these other bad effects. And so this is an example, again. So majority-minority districts, I think, from the point of view of democratic competition, have been a disaster. Then there's been a lot of emphasis on deliberation and other forms of direct democracy. Much more involvement of grassroots activists in actually making decisions and selecting candidates. It sounds great. You know, democracy is in the streets. Bring democracy to the people. But the question is, which people? And one of the things you run into with instruments of direct democracy is that activists participate disproportionately in the instruments of direct democracy, and they tend to be on the extremes of their parties. And so when you say bring democracy closer to the people, what you're tending to do is empower extremists in the parties or extremists on particular issues, rather than empowering most of what sometimes gets called the silent majority, or the typical voter, or the typical citizen. And so these instruments of direct participation can have a perverse effect of actually making governments less accountable because of the ways in which activists shape particular interventions and decisions. Another example is there's been a trend towards the direct election of party leaders. So I'll just give you one very dramatic example that we're witnessing in the UK right in the last year. Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, and he's from the far left of the Labour Party, and I'll come back to the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn got elected to the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015 after Ed Miliband lost the 2015 election. But he's way to the left of the median voter in the Labour Party, never mind in the country. He's way to the left. And so the parliamentary Labour Party, the members of parliament in the Labour Party, are way to the right of Corbyn. And they were so dissatisfied with his leadership because they saw that he was going to lead them to an electoral defeat, which he's going to do next month. So they had a vote of no confidence in Corbyn and dumped him by 172 to 40. 172 to 40 in the Parliamentary Labour Party. That is decisive, right? You would think in any parliamentary system, until pretty recently, that would have been the end of a political leader. But 3 months, that happened in June of 2016. 3 months later in September, he was re-elected by the membership, the grassroots membership of the Labour Party by 62%. So then the question is, so who is the grassroots membership of the Labour Party? Well, anybody can pay £3 and join the Labour Party, right? So activists, often in this case organized by the trade union movement, essentially did a kind of hostile takeover of the party and re-elects Corbyn. And so you have a kind of dysfunctional situation where the Parliamentary Labour Party has a leader in whom they have no confidence at all, re-elected by the membership. And in fact, the truth is, which I can go into if people are interested, the relationship between Donald Trump and the Republican Party in the US isn't that different, in the sense that they would dump, the Congressional Republican Party would dump Trump in a heartbeat if they could, but they're terrified of his base. His base, which is small, he was actually picked by 5% of the US electorate in the primaries, very low turnout in primaries. But they could savage any Republican in a primary if they turned on Trump. So it's not that different than the situation Corbyn is in the UK. And indeed, just in the last week, Corbyn has been battling in the expectations. All the polls show he's going to lose in a landslide. And you know, the long tradition in British politics is if you lead your party to a defeat, you resign. And Corbyn says he's not going to resign. He says if he gets 200 seats in Parliament, which would be, I think, the biggest electoral loss for Labour in 83 years, he says he's not going to resign. So that's an indication of this extreme disjunction between the membership of the Labour Party and the Parliamentary Labour Party. And we see this direct elections of leaders in many countries as well. Then we have direct democracy, ballot initiatives, referenda, plebiscites, again, often that work at odds with the elected parliaments. We saw in Colombia last year the very careful negotiations of a peace agreement with the FARC, then voted down in a referendum where the turnout was what was it? 30% or something, 29%? Yeah. And so, again, you have people who are in no way representative of the electorate, essentially upending the politics and making the politicians unaccountable to the people who've elected them because of the intervention of extremists through these instruments of direct democracy. In the US, much of this came about in the 1960s and 70s with the anti-tax movement. So we got Proposition 13 in California, where we had a referendum on the subject of maximum taxes, property taxes. And they passed a rule that says property taxes cannot be more than 1% of the value of property. And it passed because all the people who were against property taxes turned out and passed it, right? But the net effect of that has been a massive decline in the quality of schools in California because they now are massively underfunded. And again, it's people coming in and taking one discrete decision, taxes are too high, without reference to the effects of that decision on the rest of the system. And so you get people more and more dissatisfied with the fact that the government of California can't deliver basic services like education, when in fact this is a direct result of the direct democracy that's being introduced through the ballot initiatives, which are kind of plebiscites. So this is, again, it's an example. I think also one generalization I would make is that a lot of times the instruments of direct democracy are sort of dreamed up by the well-meaning, starry-eyed left and then hijacked by the cynical right, who are often very much better resourced and better organized and more able to take advantage of these instruments of direct participation in order to achieve whatever it is that they want. Another example is a preference for PR, proportional representation, over single-member district systems. Now here in Mexico, you mix them. You have a mixed system like in Japan, where in your parliament some are PR and some are single-member district systems. But the general trend has been away from single-member district systems towards PR. If you look at most of the third-wave democracies in the world, almost all, I'm from South Africa, they have closed-list PR. That's very typical of the new democracies. And if you look at most of Western Europe, they have PR. Most of Latin America either has open list or closed list PR, or a couple of countries have these mixed systems like you have. So why is it that people like PR? There are two main reasons why people like PR. One is that it seems somehow fairer. It seems, you know, if you have two big parties, the party may be a long way from the preferences of any given voter. Whereas in PR, you know, the Greens have their person, and the Socialists have their person, and the Communists have their person, and the Liberals have their person, and the ultra-nationalists have their person, and the Catholic Party has their person. Everybody has their people in Parliament who can then go and represent them. And they feel like it's fairer because of that this proportionality between voters and the people who represent them. But the fallacy in that reasoning is that it's fairer at the electoral stage, but not at the formation of government stage. Because the government has to, in PR you get proliferation of parties, you get more parties than two. And you have to have a coalition of 2 or 3 parties to form a government. And those parties are going to have to make deals with one another. And 2 things can happen. I'll talk more about those deals in a bit. But at least 2 things can happen when they make those deals. One is that they make compromises, which means that they betray their grassroots supporters. And when the next election comes around and the supporters try to hold them accountable, they say, oh no, it wasn't us, it was the other party in the coalition who forced us to do that. We didn't have any choice. And so in that sense, you find that politicians manage to escape accountability for the decisions that the governments that they make implement. Whereas in a 2-party system, you're either the government or you're the opposition. If you're the government, you have a program that you campaigned on, and you either implement it or you didn't implement it. But either way, the people who elected you know what you ran on, and the people who opposed you know what you ran on. And 3 or 4 or 5 years later, whenever the next election is, you can't run and hide. There's no way to run and hide and say, oh, it's their fault, it was in the coalition. So that's one problem. The other problem is that sometimes the way the mathematics works out, the arithmetic works out, tiny parties can have huge influence on coalition governments. This is very often the case in Israel, for example, where nobody can form a government without the participation of the very right-wing religious parties. And so they actually have massively disproportionate influence to their numbers because they can extract huge rents for participating in the government because they know that they can topple the government. And we see this in many systems. Right now, near your neck of the woods in Portugal, the communists are in this position where they could topple the government tomorrow, and so they have influence that's disproportionate to their numbers in the legislature. So, when people say PR is better because it's fairer, it's more representative, they're just looking at one slice. They're looking at the narrow slice of the actual election. They're not looking at what kind of government is going to be formed, what the government is going to actually do, and how what the government does is going to be perceived by the people who voted for the parties that have formed the government. So when you look at it that way, you know, the claim that PR is more representative starts to look a little less convincing. The second reason people have generally preferred PR is this is mostly my colleagues in Europe who tend to be on the ideological left, and they like redistributive policies. They like strong welfare states. They like protections for the unemployed. They like essentially redistributive politics. And it used to be the case that PR systems were more redistributive than single-member district systems. So the European systems were more redistributive. They had more progressive tax systems than, for example, the British system or the US system where they have single-member district systems. But our argument in this book is that that was really a time-bound occurrence because it depended on very strong labor parties, which were in turn the product of powerful union movements. And those very strong labor parties essentially made corporatist deals with big business, with the business parties, so the labor parties would get employment security and high wages and protection of their seniority systems, which, by the way, was not very good for women, but leaving that aside, and in return for giving the business industrial peace, no strikes, and so on. And so business found that advantageous to make those deals. But what's changed is that labor has become smaller and weaker because of changes in the global economy and because of the rise of technology, robots. And so as labor movements have become, and organized labor in particular, has become smaller and weaker, they have been able to do less good deals with business, and they are less reliable agents for downward redistribution to the people at the bottom. Because increasingly there's a large pool of structurally unemployed people who are not in the unions, who are not even in the formal labor market. And unions don't support the redistribution to them. They support redistribution to union members. So if you want to see the most extreme version of this, look at South Africa. South Africa has one of the most powerful union movements in the world. But it also has 30% unemployment and 50% youth unemployment. So we've had a transition to democracy in South Africa in 1994. We've had 5 elections. The ANC has won all of them. They've had around 60% majorities in all of them. But here are the data. The Gini coefficient in South Africa is 0.69, one of the highest in the world, and it's exactly the same as it was in 1994. The top marginal tax rate in South Africa is lower than it was in 1994. The unemployment, as I said, hasn't gone down in the least. So what you have is a labor aristocracy protected by the unions, but not redistribution downwards to the poor. And this finally exploded in 2012 in a series of massive wildcat strikes against organized labor in South Africa, as a result of which 34 mine workers were shot dead by police in a place called Marikana. It was an absolute tragedy. But I think that the moral of that story for our topic is that is a harbinger of things to come. Because as globalization has made capital mobile and the increased possibility of offshoring labor to China, to Indonesia, to Africa, to wherever it is, on the one hand, and technology is destroying jobs even more than globalization on the other, you're getting these larger and larger pools of structurally unemployed people. And the notion that strong labor parties will be the supporters of, the defenders of these people in the political system, I think is increasingly at odds with reality. And so I know in these recent elections, everybody's been focused on how the far right-wing parties have been doing, like in Holland, in the Netherlands recently, and in France, we'll see next week. Is it next week? When are the parliamentary elections? Yeah, in June, right? 2 weeks. We'll see. But the big untold story of all these elections is just look at how the Labour parties have been doing. In the Netherlands, they came in fourth. In Israel, Labour used to always be either the biggest or the second biggest party. Now they come in fourth or fifth. You were just telling me in Belgium, they come in, they're at the back of the pack. And as we'll watch Labour get decimated in Britain as well next week. So the Labour, the idea that we should have a system that depends on Labour parties as the engine of redistribution in politics, I think is something that mostly belongs in the history books. So that's the preference for PR over single-member districts. And then the other thing that is increasingly being done, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now, although maybe we should talk about it because Mexico has the strongest term limits in the world. But the other way in which many countries have tried to limit the power of political elites is through things like fixed parliaments, so that the elites can't call an election when it suits them so easily. It's another way of weakening the power of elites. So Britain has made it more difficult, for instance, for the Prime Minister to dissolve Parliament and call an election. And term limits. And you, as I said, you have probably the most extreme term limit system in the world here in Mexico, designed to limit corruption and so on. And we can talk about whether it does that or not. But again, this is all in the interest of weakening political elites and making the grassroots electorate more powerful. So those are all examples of the sorts of reforms that I'm talking about. I'll spend a little more time on the U.S., just again reflecting my own experience and knowledge, or maybe my relative ignorance of other parts of the world. But I think it's not that unusual of a story as what's happened in the U.S. We'll see the UK followed a rather similar one. 1968, this is the Vietnam War, the student movement, huge dissatisfaction with the Johnson administration in Washington, and so much dissatisfaction that President Johnson realizes he can't run for re-election, and he gives up. But his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, runs, and he's also was associated with the war in Vietnam. And there were 3 anti-war candidates, so they split the vote in the primaries. And as a result, Humphrey got the nomination. And there were riots in Chicago, there were fighting in the streets with police, and it was a sort of moment of truth for the Democratic Party. And the only way that Humphrey could damp down the discontent was to promise very major reforms in the Democratic Party, which he did. He then went on to run and lose to Richard Nixon in 1968. But the Democratic Party held these reforms. They were called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. And they did 2 things. One is make much more use of primaries and caucuses, where local selection of candidates, local selection of candidates both for the presidency and also for the legislature, and the start of descriptive representation. So starting to have quotas for women, quotas for minorities, quotas for this, quotas for that. And both of these things have deleterious consequences, as I indicated to you. And so as a result of these reforms, 4 years later, George McGovern, the same McGovern as in the name McGovern-Fraser, the McGovern of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, ran and won the nomination under these new rules. He was way to the left of the median voter in the Democratic Party, never mind the median voter in the US. And so in the general election, he was wiped out by Nixon. I think he lost 49 out of the 50 states, one of the biggest wipeouts in American history. And this is a sort of textbook example of the fact that activists picked a candidate who couldn't possibly win in the general election. So after that, political reform people tend always to be fighting the last war. So then there's a reaction to that. And what's the reaction to that? Oh, this has gone too far. We need to counteract it. So they create something called superdelegates. And what are superdelegates? Superdelegates are basically party elites. And the superdelegates are there to counteract the power of these primaries and caucuses and give the party leadership some control over who gets elected. And so the superdelegates sort of pull the Democratic Party back to the center of American politics over the next couple of decades. And so you get first with Jimmy Carter and then with Bill Clinton, you get much more centrist candidates elected by the Democratic Party, largely because the superdelegates limit the power of the primaries and caucuses, and you get people who can actually win. And so that system goes along for a while, but it then starts to breed a certain amount of dissatisfaction, which all came to a head in the last election when the superdelegates got very strongly behind Hillary Clinton's candidacy very early on. And the Bernie Sanders campaign, he was the left-wing candidate, were furious and said the whole thing's rigged and it's against the grassroots. And to some extent that was true. And at the end of the process, when Sanders had finally to concede to defeat, he made, again, this is fighting the last war, he made a deal with the Clinton campaign that he would only support Hillary's for the presidency if she agreed on a commission to change this rule for the next election. So that the situation they now have in the Democratic Party, where they just appointed the commission 2 weeks ago, that is in fact going to get rid of the strength of the superdelegates. They're going to be required, as they currently are in the Republican Party, they're going to be required to support the candidate, at least on the first ballot, that wins in the primaries and caucuses. And that will make it possible for somebody, or will make it easier for somebody like Sanders to win the next time around. When Sanders made this deal with Clinton, Trump accused him of having made a deal with the devil. Sanders made a deal with the devil, said Trump. In fact, Clinton made a deal in a way with the devil because she has sacrificed the capacity of the Democratic Party to produce a centrist candidate in order to get the short-term advantage of Sanders' support in her campaign, which failed anyway. If you look at the story in the Republican Party, it's kind of a lag function of the story in the Democrats. So what happened is they too, after 1968, put in primaries, and they too had superdelegates, and they too had reactions against the superdelegates, and they too disempowered the superdelegates. And so they had the situation on their hands in 2016 where they couldn't stop Trump, because in the Republican Party, the superdelegates must vote. The superdelegates are meaningless. They must vote the way the primary or caucuses in their state voted. So they have no role, in fact, at all. Only if it goes to more than one ballot. So there they were confronted with this massive hostile takeover of their party by someone who had never even been a Republican, and there's just, you know, this populist candidate, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And so they couldn't stop it. Now, interestingly for the Republicans, if Trump had lost, they would have gotten rid of this rule. That's the first thing they would have done. They would have gotten rid of this rule and re-empowered the superdelegates to make sure this didn't happen to them again. Of course, the fact that Trump won means that he's not going to agree to any change in the rules so long as he's the titular leader of the Republican Party. So that the Trump phenomenon is going to have to play itself out in American politics, whether that takes, you know, on current showing it might take 2 weeks, but it might take 4 years, it might take 8 years, but whatever it is, until Trump is out of the picture, it's very difficult to see how the Republicans can restructure their nominating process to prevent the extreme right wing of the party, which were the people who elected Trump and the people who elect the Tea Party candidates in Congress, from undermining their control. So this has been the story in the US. If you look at the UK story, I've already told you some of it. Labour introduced direct elections of the leadership, and it produced that no confidence vote standoff between the Parliamentary Labour Party and the membership that I already mentioned to you. Something similar has happened with the Conservatives. It used to be the case that the leader of the Conservative Party somehow emerged out of conversations in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Support would just gel around one candidate, and then there would be an announcement. It was sort of like announcing there's a new pope. There would be an announcement that there's a new leader of the Conservative Party. And then as the pressure to democratize things came along, they first introduced election within the Parliamentary Conservative Party. That wasn't enough. There was then pressure to have direct voting from the grassroots of the Conservative Party. And they now have a kind of hybrid system where the Parliamentary Conservative Party votes until it's down to 2 candidates, and then it goes to the membership at large to pick one of the 2. And interestingly, Theresa May just got lucky because the 2 candidates were going to be her and Boris Johnson, who was the pro-Brexiteer, more populist candidate, who would surely have been elected by the grassroots of the Conservative Party had it gone to them. But at the last minute, this Judas figure, Michael Gove, who had been promoting Johnson, turned on him and said, Johnson doesn't have what it takes to be Prime Minister. Elect me instead. So it was a kind of murder-suicide by Michael Gove, and it meant Theresa May was the only person left standing, and so that was just a quirk of personalities and so forth. But in fact, the way that the rules work, the Tories would have wound up with Boris Johnson, and as a party, they wouldn't be in anywhere near as strong a position as they are now with Theresa May, who's much closer to the median voter in British politics than Boris Johnson would ever be. So similar stories elsewhere we could pursue, but I think that gives you the general flavor that although there's this fighting the last war quality to these reforms, the general drift nonetheless has been towards more and more decentralization and more direct control of politicians, which nonetheless hamstrings the capacity of governments to deliver the things that most voters actually want. And that's our constant refrain in this book. So our argument is that 2 large, strong parties are best, they're alternating in government. They then compete over programs. They compete over programs rather than providing clientelist goods for particular groups. Because if there are only going to be 2 parties, you know that if you can't get the largest number of voters the other party is going to be the government. There's no third possibility, right? So you have to have a platform that can appeal to more than a narrow segment. It can't just be labor or just be business or just be the Greens. You've got to think about putting together a platform that can appeal to a broad array of the electorate, or you won't even have a chance. So the bad, as I've already intimated, are multiple parties and coalition governments. For the reasons that I said, they don't, in fact, have much in the way of accountability for what governments do. They're easily hijacked by small parties that are essential to coalitions, and there's very little accountability. They tend to be clientelist. So multiple parties tend to deliver goods to the group that's voting for them only. This is what I'm going to call wholesale clientelism. So strong, small parties deliver wholesale clientelism. So the labor-oriented party in a PR system is going to deliver very strong protections for labor. That's all it's going to care about. The religious parties in Israel are going to make sure, you know, that the stores are closed on Saturdays, or whatever it is that their members want. They're going to bring narrow clientelistic benefits to their electorates. Then the ugly are what I call the hybrid systems, where you have weak parties because of primaries or caucuses. So the US is an ugly system. Or in PR systems, where you have lots of intra-party competition. A lot of Latin American countries with openness PR, you don't have that here. But you get intra-party competition, and the dynamics of intra-party competition are basically retail clientelism. Just as with primaries in single-member district system, people are going to promise local goods, bridges to nowhere, money for the district, for pet projects, this kind of thing. Narrow benefits to small segments of the election. So this again is pretty much summing up stuff I've already said. For Duverger to work, we need districts that more or less mirror the population of the country. And we need parliamentarism with strong parties and a dynamic relationship between the backbenchers and the front benches. So the idea is that the front benches select the backbenchers, who select the front benches, who select the backbenchers, who select the front benches, and so all the time. So the leadership of the party at any given moment is strong. They set the program, and they make sure that the candidates who are selected to run in constituencies can not only win in their constituencies, but can contribute to a broad national program, right? So that's a sense in which they're strong. On the other hand, they're accountable, because if they don't deliver, they're gone, right? If they don't deliver, they're gone. Then there'll be a vote of no confidence from the parliamentary party, and they'll be out of there. So, you know, unlike in the American system where the parties are weak, you can have somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who's lost 3 elections in a row for the Democrats, right? 2010, 2012, 2014. The Democrats have lost all those elections. But the Democratic Party in Congress is too weak. The backbenchers are too weak to get rid of her, right? In a well-functioning parliamentary system, she would have been gone a long time ago, right? So they're strong so long as they deliver victory for their own backbenchers. Otherwise, they're vulnerable. And I just want to mention that one thing I'm not talking about here, which is obviously hugely important, is the role of money in politics, which is endogenous to all this, because that's a big problem no matter what electoral system you have. So I'm just mentioning it to say, of course I know it's a huge problem, but it's not a problem I'm talking about here. I've written in that book that Stephen was talking about. I have a lot to say about money in politics if people are interested. Okay, this slide I'm going to skip. So I just want to sort of drive home the core of the argument by making 3 points about why two big parties are best, where they have incentives for long-term encompassing programs. So one is that when they put together the program that they're going to campaign on, they have to discount every piece of it against every other piece of it, right? So whereas if you think about campaigning in a PR system, you have these much more special interest parties saying, all we care about is the environment. All we care about is the environment. All we care about is labor rights. All we care about is labor rights. So they just push for those things. And if anything, they'll take extreme positions about those things because they don't know who they're going to necessarily be in a coalition with later. So they'll worry about that later. What they want to do right now is turn out their core voters. That's the most, it's not only the most important thing, it's the only thing, right, that matters when you're campaigning in a PR system is to turn out your core voters. Nothing else matters. And then you worry about the deal you're going to make for a coalition later. Whereas in a two-party system, you have to create the platform before you run. So you have to get the compromises against the constituent groups before you run. And that means you have to work out how far you're going to go with labor rights and how far you're going to trade them off against other things before you create the program on which you run with which you run for election. So that's what I mean by the planks in the program have to be discounted against the other planks. Secondly, they have to internalize the costs of the deals they make. If you think about corporatism, the great corporatism of the 1980s and 1990s, deals between business and labor. And they both get exactly what they want out of the deal. But that might come at the expense of consumers and the unemployed, right? Because neither business nor labor cares particularly about consumer interests or unemployed interests. So they can externalize the cost of their deal onto the people that they're not expecting to be in the coalition. Whereas when you're running and you know that if you don't win, the other party's going to be the government, you have to worry about those other people. Because if you don't get them, the other party's going to get them. They're not going to wind up in some small party that nobody cares about, right? So you have to worry about people outside of your natural coalition and try to get them as well. So you're going to be less likely to externalize the costs of your deals onto third parties. And then the third thing is, in some ways the most important for accountability, is that politicians are going to be more likely to can make sincere pitches to the electorate. So let me explain what I mean here, but with an analogy. In labor negotiations, if labor negotiations go to arbitration, what it means is when the two parties can't agree, they get an arbitrator, and the arbitrator is a neutral third party who comes in and listens to both sides and then says what's going to be the outcome. Okay. There are two kinds of arbitration. One is the arbitrator listens to business, the arbitrator listens to labor, then the arbitrator does fact-finding, looks at their demands and says, you people are being too extreme on this question, you people are doing too extreme on that question, and the arbitrator comes up with a compromise. And that's the deal that's accepted. So when you go to arbitration, you're essentially empowering the arbitrator to design your deal, okay? So in that system, you have a big incentive to take very extreme positions, right? Because you're going to have to make concessions later. So you have a big incentive to be highly strategic in the positions that you take, so that you can have you're going to say you want things that you don't actually want, because you can bargain them away later, right? And you can let the arbitrator take them away. It doesn't really matter. It's not what you really wanted anyway. But there's another kind of arbitration, which is called last best offer arbitration. In last best offer arbitration, each side makes their demands, and the arbitrator has to pick one. The arbitrator can't craft a compromise. Okay? So when you go into last best offer arbitration, it's all or nothing, right? You have to put out something there that you know it's going to be either what you're putting out or what the other side's putting out that's going to get selected. And there's no other possibility. That's what we call by last best offer arbitration. Each side makes the last best offer, and then the arbitrator just picks one. Yeah? Okay, so in last best offer arbitration, what do we find from the empirical studies? We find that people take much more reasonable positions, that they don't behave strategically, because they know that if they take an extreme position and the other side doesn't, the arbitrator is going to pick the other side, right? So the defense of a last best offer arbitration is that it gives both sides the incentives not to be strategic, but to be sincere in the programs that they craft to put in front of the arbitrator. Well, the same thing holds with two-party competition, right? Another way of thinking about the two-party competition, it's like last best offer arbitration, because you're putting out a program, the other party's putting out a program, and the electorate's going to pick one, and that is going to be the program. There isn't going to be negotiating later. There isn't going to be some third deal struck. One or other is going to pick. And so politicians have a much stronger incentive to, as I said, be sincere about the programs that they're going to advocate and then implement if elected into government. So just to the end now, yeah. This is just, I talk about party size and party strength, just for people who like pictures. The UK is strong with two large parties, single-member district. You can have large parties with PR, strong parties with PR, as in South Africa. You can have two weak parties, as in the US, and you can have multiple weak parties, as in Brazil. And if we think about this is again a summary slide of what I've said in this lecture. If you have two strong parties, as in the UK before they started messing it up, you get programmatic competition like last best offer arbitration. If you have multiple parties like Italy, then you're going to get wholesale clientelism. Parties are going to promise benefits to groups. If you have weak parties, you're going to get retail clientelism. Bridges to nowhere, things for people in the district. And if you have both multiple parties and weak parties, you're going to get wholesale and retail clientelism, corruption everywhere you look, and that's the Israeli story. So reform agendas are hard because of this misdiagnosis that I've been arguing against. People think there's not enough decentralized control when in fact there's too much. They're hard because the beneficiaries of the status quo aren't likely to give it up. As I said, Trump's not going to let them change the rules in the Republican Party anytime soon. If you look at the Italian referendum last year, the Prime Minister was actually trying to undo a lot of these decentralizing reforms, but all the vested interests leapt into action against him, and as a result, he had his head handed to him. They're hard because of starry-eyed progressives who think this is more bringing democracy to the people, and that's a good thing, but in fact they're naive because most of these reforms are hijacked by much more cynical people on the right. They're hard because of the misguided faith in PR that I've talked about, and they're hard, this is a summary of everything I've said, because the real direction that reform needs to go in is the opposite of the direction of that everybody's talking about, and that's why we're writing our book. So I'll stop there, and you can all tell me why I'm wrong.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. So we'll open the floor a little bit for questions, comments.
You're going to field the questions, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. I have two questions. The first one is, so let's say your empirical story is right, and these institutions you're criticizing have led to voter disaffection. Now, it seems to me that that is a very limited basis for casting an overall normative assessment of those institutions. And one of the reasons would be that perhaps voter disaffection is due to other worrisome reasons. For instance, it's based on false beliefs or ignorance about the overall performance of those institutions. So it seems to me that you would need some kind of metric that would allow you to identify whether those institutions have in fact, say for instance, reduced domination in society or something like that. So just the fact that voters are disaffected, and partly because of these institutions, seems to be a limited basis for criticizing those institutions. So that's the first question. The second question is somewhat related. In your analysis of institutions of democratic competition, you're leaving aside a set of institutions that have to do not with the way in which votes are processed and turned into government, but let's call it the quality of the votes. So, for instance, many of the problems you're mentioning would be solved if there were compulsory voting. So I'm wondering what your views on compulsory voting would be. Another set of questions have to do with recent debates on finding institutional ways to enhance the epistemic competence of voters and to minimize, well, precisely the kind of situations that you described, right? Voters voting against taxes and then complaining about poor services. So that just seems to be a problem about, a problem with the voters. So those are the two questions.
So on your first question, I hope I don't lose track of them all, but on your first question, so I should say when we're dealing with electoral systems, it's by definition second best in that there's no perfect electoral system. So as I said, we call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we don't call it the best, the worst, and the truly hideous. So there are trade-offs. There are disadvantages to every electoral system. And so, our thesis in the book is that nonetheless, single-member district is better than PR, and PR is better than these mixed systems. But within that, stronger are better than weaker. So that's the thesis of the book. Now, as for the normative motivation, the key normative claim is that accountability is more important than participation. That's the key normative claim, and that there really is a trade-off between participation at the direct participation and accountability of governments. But at the end of the day, what's most important in a country is what governments actually do. And so that's where the rubber should meet the road in terms of voters holding people with power to account. And so that's the link to non-domination in my previous work. If you don't agree, I think if I can't, put another way, if I can't persuade you that accountability is the most important value, I'm unlikely to persuade you of anything else. So I do think that's where I have to do the heavy lifting in the book, for sure. Now, on your other points, so I want to partly push back and partly agree with you. I think compulsory voting would be great, for sure. But compulsory participation in primaries and caucuses, it's hard for me to envisage that actually happening. But absolutely, it would mean that many of these things would be less bad than they are. So I'm a big fan of that. Your other proposal was which?
Well, it wasn't really a proposal. Whether you have thought of these other or enhancing the competence?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm a hard-boiled Schumpeterian in the sense that I think that I'm fine with Danzian ignorance. I don't think that that trying to have more knowledgeable voters is going to solve many of these problems. I think trying to have more accountable politicians is much more likely to solve problems than trying to have more knowledgeable voters.
Well, except that for holding them accountable, they have to be knowledgeable enough to assess the things that they did.
I don't think it's about knowledge. I think that, for instance, if you look at Proposition 13, what happens is the anti-tax coalition, you know, their basic view of government spending is it's all corrupt, starve the beast, shut the money down. It's all going to be wasted or wind up in you know, corrupt ventures. So let's just stop it. That's their value. So I don't think they care if the schools go to hell or, you know, they'll send their kids to private schools, or so they're not, it's not an epistemic problem. It's not that they don't understand. They do understand. I mean, I wrote a book on the estate tax once, on the repeal of the estate tax. You know, you could get 70% to say, yes, we should repeal the estate tax. But for most voters, if you explain to them, well, then the cost of prescription drugs is going to go up, they stop supporting it. So they're not, you know, most voters aren't stupid, but the organized interests that wanted to get rid of the estate tax, they didn't have any illusions that it was going to put more fiscal pressure on the government. So I didn't think it was a cognitive problem. I think it's that if you create instruments, it's like I think most of these instruments it's like a Maginot Line. You know, you create this thing and you don't think about who's going to do an end run around them and going to be able to do things with these institutions that nobody would ever have intended. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. This is working well. Okay. I obviously did not read your book, so probably you have an answer or the evidence for my questions in the book. But for what you said in the presentation, I am really puzzled by your answer to the puzzle. And I'm puzzled both on normative and on empirical grounds. Normatively, because you are proposing majoritarian politics to reduce the alienation of voters. So that, in a plural society, of course, is not going to happen. For instance, what you are proposing is exactly what the defenders of the pre-democratic order in Mexico propose. That is, the PRI will fully concur with your argument. Obviously, they would like to have a more, concentrated electoral party system. Of course, go back to single-member district elections. And given the odd mixed systems that we have, they would like to have a mixed system with a stronger majoritarian element. So I'm really puzzled on normative grounds with what you say. But I'm more puzzled empirically, because you are making a contrast between the failures of the ideal of pluralist institutions, enhancing and highlighting the ideals of majoritarian institutions, which is completely unfair, both from the point of view of institutional design and for what we know in comparative politics about the effects of these institutions. So that, for instance, you criticize and you provided good arguments about an estylized version of PR, how people defend PR. But PR is a world. I mean, we can discuss several elements of PR and distinguish between different PR systems. The same that we can discuss the details of referendum. For instance, you cited the case of Colombia. Well, of course, Colombia is not a good example because, first of all, for the agenda-setting power that it provided to the executive, which is wrong on normative grounds. Also empirically, because it didn't provide a threshold of voters to participate in order to declare valid the voting. Right? So that is not a good example. So we can discuss, well, maybe it's not referendum, certain types of design of referendum which are wrong. And so, of course, an open defense of referendum and plebiscite, you can criticize, and I would agree with you. But say, for instance, you praise a single-member district plurality. Now, if you have a plurality of political cleavages at the district level and at the national level, you're not going to get exactly a two-party system. You're going to get 2 parties and a half, 2 parties and 2/3, right? And you're going to create an institutional power for the 2 main parties that is, to a great extent, artificial. And you're punishing, third options in a way that will be, unpleasant for those voters that opted for those options. Second, with single-member district plurality, you increase problems of districting. You increase problems of malapportionment, which is very well documented in the literature, and you increase the probability that the party with less votes at the popular level will get more seats. Actually, one of the reasons why you see these distortions in the Electoral College in the US is because most electors in most states are elected by plurality rule, not by PR. And that's why you see this distortion in the US. So it's funny that you mentioned the US, and this is exactly something that happens in the US. And finally, on the empirical level, as you know and you probably discuss in the book, there is a whole literature discussing exactly that problem that you mentioned about PR, that PR is good about, channeling diversity representation at the electoral level, but then when you have the formation of government, then that's not going to happen. They could betray, this coalition government could betray. But the argument made that precisely because it diversifies representation at the level of government formation, the party of the median voter, if such a thing exists in the country, will be represented at the level of the coalition. Of course, it will have greater influence at the level of policy making. And that's why Bingham Powell found, it has been disputed, I know, that, in PR systems, the distance between the preferences of the policymakers and the preferences of the median voter in the country is closer than in single-member district plurality. So I'm not sure where you're discussing all this in the book, but I'm puzzled by the empirical evidence. And finally, just one point, how do you get from here to there? Voters and small parties are not going to allow this move to majoritarian politics.
Okay, so I agree with a good deal of what you said. To some extent, we're talking across purposes. So this is the basic framework and the ideal cases I'm talking about. But as I said, for single-member district systems to work and produce, for Duverger's law to work, you do need districts that more or less mirror the polity. And where that isn't the case, it's not going to work. It's not going to produce 2 parties. India is the obvious case. But before I get to that, as far as countries like Mexico and the PRI are concerned, you have one party in office for decades. You didn't have alternation of 2 parties. So that isn't the kind of system that I'm saying is a good system. Anytime you have one party, one dominant party, you're going to get large-scale clientelism because it's going to be the way that they're going to maintain their position. So I think that upends this logic. Now, I also, as many of the examples you give indicate, there are ways to make, there are ways to address the problems with PR and make it operate more like a single-member district system, with the thresholds or with reapportioning votes, as in the Spanish system. You can do various forms of electoral engineering to limit party proliferation and make, as in Germany, make PR system function more like two-party systems, where you get bigger, stronger parties. And those are the kind of reforms that we're advocating. So for us, it's very much not a question of how do you get from here to there, but starting from where you are, what is going to make the system better rather than continue to make it worse, right? So in the US system, for instance, I just mentioned the majority-minority districts, but that's only one of the ways in which they've screwed it up. A second is that the courts have allowed partisan gerrymandering, which essentially says the parties can split up the state so that the only election that matters is the primary. So you have this bizarre situation in the US where more than 90% of seats are safe seats. They're not competitive at all. So if you're starting with a single-member district system that has the properties of the US system, the right reforms are away from that. They're toward going back to making the districts more genuinely competitive across parties, not intra-party. Intra-party competition produces retail clientelism. We want inter-party competition. And they've done away with almost all of the inter-party competition in the US system with partisan gerrymandering. It's made worse by other things like blue state, red state sorting, and other things. But those, so the idea is very much an incrementalist book. It's saying, starting from where you are, if you've got weak parties, try and strengthen them. If you've got uncompetitive constituencies, try and make them competitive. If you're in a PR system, again, starting from where you are, the point of the ideals is to set out which direction you should be pushing in, right? So if you have, like in South Africa, they have a PR system with a 0 threshold. What's a recipe for disaster? As soon as the ANC starts to fracture, there's going to be massive party proliferation. So they need to make it more like the German system. Okay, so that's the point of talking about the ideal cases. Not to say we should scrap every electoral system in the world and create single-member district systems. No, so that's it. On the plebiscites and referenda, I really want to push back hard because no matter how you structure them, referenda are a way of extracting a policy from the bundle and voting on it separately. And that means the defenders of it don't have to discount it against the other things that they're advocating. And that produces very perverse politics. So I think forcing, the more bundling you can have before the election, the better. And the way you get that, the way you try to engineer that's going to depend on where you start. And so I'm all for starting where we are and not rebuilding. We're rebuilding the ship at sea. I just don't want to make more holes in it. Okay,
yeah. Thank you for visiting us. It's a pleasure and it's a great honor to have you here. And I'm professor of politics at the politics department. I agree with a great deal of what you said, and some aspects of it I was a bit worried about, so I'm going to focus on that. But I wanted to say, I think I understand a lot of the impetus of the arguments that you're making with the rise of populism and so on around the world. However, I wanted for my intervention, I wanted to make a little bit of the opposite argument against some of what you said, because that worried me. And I'm going to repeat some of what the Professor Gabriel Negreto said, but I'm going to say it a bit. I'm going to try saying it a bit more dramatically, perhaps, so that I can say something new. First is I wanted to say, because there's so many students here, it is important to say that democracy is very important. I say this because they were born in democracy, but their teachers, like we did not. Okay. So in a say, we pushed for democracy. I want to say our generation fought for democracy in Mexico. Okay. Yeah. So we are very keenly aware of the problems of the opposite of democracy, and I wanted to mention them because I think some of the critiques you were making of democracy might be interpreted as going in the other direction. And we have to remember that the opposite of decentralization, let's say centralization, can lead to corruption and lack of accountability and chronic capitalism and the entrenchment of elites and so on. And I think I wanted to raise whether some of the proposals or some of the aspects of your arguments might lead to this and whether you can find ways to counteract these problems. Okay? The first one is the two-party system. Okay? In the two-party system, okay, that you're advocating for. In my mind, I think of the situation in Venezuela, where you had a two-party system, AD and COPEI, for many decades, and that eventually unraveled into an undemocratic system because those two parties, they colluded, and they were strong. In fact, according to Koppage, they were probably the strongest parties in the planet. Okay, they created a party.
So why did they collude?
Isn't it maybe it's the natural dynamics of two large firms will collude, two large parties might collude. We don't know. I don't know why they colluded, but there is this risk that these two. Is there no collusion between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in America? I think there's plenty of collusions in a number of issues. For example, one of the problems of having two parties instead of multiple parties is ignoring not only voters, as you said, but issues. There's plenty of issues that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they just ignore because they don't, it's not part of their agenda, and it's not beneficial for them to talk about those issues, right? Also, the candidate selection. Okay, so you're criticizing primaries, and that's fine. I've been researching primaries since my PhD dissertation, and I defended primaries because we have to think about the alternatives of it, right? Maybe you have a certain idea of a convention in your mind, but around the world, the alternative to primaries are not the American-style conventions, okay? They're smoked-filled rooms. Those are the alternatives to primaries. And we have seen this in Mexico and in other countries. When you don't hold primaries, and there has been a push, legal and social and political, to have more primaries in Mexico for this reason, because otherwise you have entrenchments. Entrenchment of a small group of politicians who hold the party hostage, right? And you create dynasties as well, right? So we can see it in the Estado de Mexico, an election that we're going to have in a few weeks. One of the front runners had his father be governor and his grandfather be governor, if I'm not mistaken, right? So I'm just saying this so that you may bring some subtlety, perhaps, to some of your arguments. The PR argument as well. I mean, one of the benefits of PR systems is to give representation, as you said, to certain minorities. But remember, some of those minorities might be violent. This is why giving them representation is important to avoid this type of violence, such as giving, for example, a seat to guerrilla members in Colombia. Okay, so I'm probably gonna, I'm gonna stop this there. But I wanted to perhaps motivate you or push you a little bit to think about some of the directions in which your arguments might be interpreted, which I'm sure you don't want to go in that direction.
Yeah, so first of all, we say up front in the book, we're talking about variants of democracy here, and all variants of democracy are better than authoritarianism. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I know about authoritarian systems, and nobody wants to go there. So we're talking about something else. But then, you said the value of accountability, governments be accountable. For me, that is the most important value. So it's just that not all good things go together. And there really are trade-offs between accountability and participation. You've really got to think about which you want. And if you want, if you want accountability, again, you've got to think about who should be held accountable. And our argument is that the actual government should be held accountable. One of the things I like about well-functioning two-party systems, which you didn't have in Mexico for decades, and you don't have in any single-party dominant system, and you don't get in PR systems very well, is a well-organized opposition. Because you don't get an opposition coalition, right? Opposite the government coalition, so you get diffuse opposition. In two-party systems, one of the other big merits of them, I think, is you get a well-organized parliamentary opposition, and that limits corruption. It shines light in dark corners. It's a government in waiting. It is the instrument. Think of Prime Minister's Questions, which anybody can go and watch on YouTube. That's the instrument of accountability in two-party systems. So I think accountability is the most important value, and that's why I'm pushing for that. So that was one of your points. Just to remind me briefly the other point.
Well, whether two parties will collude and ignore issues.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know enough about Venezuela to comment. You do get collusion in the U.S., but you get collusion because the parties are weak. So the only way in which they can implement legislation is through cross-party deals. This is what John Boehner did. All the major bills he passed in the last parliament before they kicked him out, before the Tea Party kicked him out of the Republican side, were all bipartisan deals. This last week when they passed the budget resolution, Ryan couldn't pass it with the Republican Party. They had to pass it with Democrat. So I think you do get collusion in two-party system, at least in the U.S., but it's a product of party weakness, not of party strength. When the parties are strong, they govern. They implement their programs and they, off to the races. It's when they're weak and the leadership of the party can't get their backbenchers to support their program, that they engage in all these other deals, which then muddy accountability, because then they say, well, we had to do this because we had to accommodate the people we made the deal with, and so on and so forth. On candidate selection, I think I want to make 2 points about candidate selection. One is the alternatives are not only smoke-filled rooms and party apparatchiks versus primaries. Because, for instance, the superdelegates. The superdelegates are not the answer. The superdelegates in the U.S. system are a really terrible Band-Aid on a system that's badly designed to begin with. The superdelegates are not the congressional party members. They're party apparatchiks. They're bureaucrats. They are not the people whose election depends on the leader that they have. Again, this is the ideal. But what you want to move towards is a system in which the backbenchers and the front benches are actually dependent on one another doing well, right? That's what I said. Somebody like Pelosi in a really well-functioning parliamentary system would have been out of there years ago. She's protected because the backbenchers can't coordinate. They're weak, and because of presidentialism. She's protected, but she's ineffective. So she looks like a strong, some people say, oh, she must be a strong leader. She can survive losing all these elections. She's protected, but she's ineffective. What you have in the U.S. system is not empowering them. They had the smoke-filled rooms, and so then they went to the primary. Instead, they should have gone from the smoke-filled rooms to the congressional leaderships in the parliament, who, at the end of the day, are essentially delegating power to the leader. And if the leader doesn't deliver, they chuck him out, right? So that's the ideal. But so that's what I think is the healthiest system to move toward. Are we out of time?
One more quick
Okay.
question. You got me thinking with the accountability is more important than participation. But in your talk and your book is mostly about this vertical accountability. And of course there is the other horizontal accountability, the checks and balances part. So a parallel thing that has been happening in many places, including Latin America, due in part to the decentralization of the parties and increasing competition, is the creation of these autonomous institutions at the constitutional level, central banks, etc. But what's your take on those? Do you think that increases accountability, so it's a solution to the problem, to the lack of vertical accountability that you mentioned, or because they also take out issues from the bundle that is to be discussed by the parties, you should think it's not a good direction?
That's a great question. I'm extremely suspicious of them, with a couple of exceptions. I'm extremely suspicious of independent central banks. I'm extremely suspicious of independent courts. All the evidence from the U.S., for example, in this I agree with my former colleague, now deceased Bob Dahl, that if you want to look at the protection of minorities, the protection of individual rights, all the heavy lifting is done by getting democracy. Adding constitutional courts on top and bills of rights on top doesn't deliver much. And in the U.S. context, the court has done more than, I mean, we didn't talk about money in politics. The court is the biggest instrument of money in politics starting in 1976 when they said money is speech, and, you know, it's gone downhill ever since. So I'm suspicious of, I mean, again, I've written elsewhere about that, and but basically I'm very suspicious of independent political units, especially if they dressed up as having technocratic competence, because there's no neutral technocratic competence in politics. I think the two exceptions that I think independent electoral commissions can be hugely important, and I think in Mexico the independent electoral commission's been important. I think in South Africa it's been important, and there are obvious reasons for that. But you know, I think of that as in a separate category. And then there's the issue of districting. You know, in the U.S. they have this terrible system where the party that controls the state legislature does the redistricting every 10 years. When this, you know, if you wanted to think what's the worst possible way to do it, whether you should have independent commissions do it, I'm not sure. It would certainly be better than the current U.S. system. But the British system is pretty good. The British system is a commission does it every 10 years when the census come out. A commission does it and makes a recommendation, and it's like last best offer arbitration in the sense that Parliament can accept it or reject it, but they can't change it. So they could say no, and then the commission would have to go and do something else, and they could say yes or no. But they can't fiddle with it. So that's kind of quasi-independent with still some democratic control. But with those two exceptions, I'm deeply suspicious of allegedly independent institutions, and I think they too often, and here the U.S. is Exhibit A, they often get captured and hijacked by the most powerful interests. Thank you for coming.